When you think of school segregation, you might envision a rural community in the deep South. But a new report that came out this week from the Civil Rights Project at UCLA paints a very different picture. The report shows schools in New York suffer from the worst racial segregation of any U.S. state, and city schools, New York City, also earned depressingly dismal marks for diversity. Professor Gary Orfield, who co-authored the report, says the racial divide in schools is due largely in part to housing patterns. We spoke via Skype earlier today. Professor, nobody likes the idea of segregated schools. Segregation, one of those terms that people just inherently blanch at in this country. But beyond just the distasteful aspect of it, what is the negative side of a segregated school, particularly in its impact on children and their education?
So we've had a half century of research, more than that actually, on segregated schools. Some of it pioneering research was done right in New York City. The problem with segregated schools is, first of all, they're not just segregated by race. They're segregated by race plus poverty. And in New York, more than twice as many poor kids on average in a classroom of a Black or Latino student as a white student. This means that those kids come to school with fewer resources at home, more health problems, lots more instability in their lives because they have to move from housing problems. Neighborhoods that are less supportive and more threatening, many things that schools have to deal with. And we know that there's a very systematic relationship between the poverty of school and its effects and its opportunities. One of the most important things is that teachers with experience and expertise tend to move away from high poverty schools to more middle class schools, and from resegregating or segregated schools to schools with more diversity or white schools. The fellow students and the teachers are the two most important resources of a school, and they're systematically unequal. In terms of other things, you really can't learn how to live and work very effectively, in most cases, crossing racial and ethnic and social class lines if you grow up and live and are educated in a very high poverty, all minority school, what we call the apartheid schools.
You know, when most people think of segregation and segregated schools, they think of the old Jim Crow South, where segregation was done intentionally. Is there any indication that segregation in New York or New York City is being done intentionally?
Here again, the question is a complicated question because nobody's passing any law or policy that says we should have a white school. But choice systems that create lots of small schools and lots of charter schools and so forth can produce schools like this. They can produce what Jonathan Kozol called boutique schools, little schools that are overwhelmingly occupied by more privileged families who have figured out how to deal with the complicated choice systems, or who live in neighborhoods where they have preference because of their residential address. But no, nobody's setting up legally defined white schools.
Professor, most school districts are linked to geographic boundaries, which begs the question whether it's the schools that are segregated or the neighborhoods are. How connected is that to the composition of one particular neighborhood, and are there schools that are more segregated than their neighborhoods are?
This is a matter of the neighborhoods being segregated and producing segregated schools and having the other mechanisms that we have, which are choice systems, which are spreading rapidly in our country, operated in a way that increases rather than diminishes the segregation. So neighborhood segregation is very important. School district boundary lines are very important. In Connecticut, the state Supreme Court found that the separation of the metropolitan areas into so many separate school districts was a fundamental violation of the state constitution. It required that there be regional cooperation.
Our region certainly has a history when it comes to school segregation and using busing to try to remediate that problem. We've seen it in Rochester, we've seen it in Yonkers, but a lot of people wonder if there's any evidence that busing students in actually helps solve the problem, either from a balancing the number standpoint or for how they benefit school kids.
Busing itself is just a means to get to school. Most American kids are bused to school. Very few were ever bused for desegregation purposes. Where it was done mostly in the South, Where it really worked best was where it was done most extensively and included the city and the suburbs. In some of those communities, like Charlotte and Raleigh, there were no segregated schools in the entire metropolitan area, almost no segregated schools for 30 years. And those places also experienced gains in residential segregation and gains in educational achievement. But what we've been talking about and what our report talks about isn't mandatory student reassignment, which is what we call busing. It should be called school integration, actually. Busing was George Wallace's term. But what we're doing now is using choice programs to try to increase diversity and open opportunities. And that's what we're recommending, that there be choice programs and there should be conscious efforts in gentrifying neighborhoods and racially changing suburbs to work together on both school and housing dimensions to assure that you not only get diversity, but that it lasts and that it supports a lasting diverse community. Yes, integration helps students. There's 50 years of research that shows that it helps. It's not a miracle, but it does tend to change the lives of all students in the sense that they're more likely to graduate from high school, they're more likely to go to college, they're more likely to be prepared to live and work in interracial settings. Some of those effects are for whites as well as minority students. Integrated schools properly run are an advantage, and it's an advantage for disadvantaged students, and it's an advantage in important ways for privileged students.
Professor Gary Orfield, Distinguished Research Professor at UCLA and co-director of the Civil Rights Project at UCLA. Professor, thanks very much.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Interesting subject, lots to talk about. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll hear what our panel has to say about school segregation in New York State. Stay with us.